días, muy buenos días para todos, and welcome to the annual meetings of the Boards of Governors of the IDB and IDB Invest. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Mi nombre es Anthony Tejada y desde ayer les estoy acompañando en esta serie de seminarios donde estamos hablando de temas y enfoques muy importantes. Qué bueno verlos hoy nuevamente acompañándonos. Sean todos bienvenidos a este salón.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Alba Mercado. Qué placer estar aquí con ustedes nuevamente. Ayer disfrutamos de seminarios enriquecedores y hoy tenemos 5 más que nos permitirán conversar sobre temas claves para nuestra región. Vamos a conversar, Anthony, algunos aspectos prácticos. Por favor, identifiquen las salidas de emergencia más cercanas en el salón. Nuestro hashtag oficial para las redes sociales es hashtag Asamblea Anual BID.
Our official hashtag for the social media is IDB Annual Meeting.
Recordarles que contamos con interpretación simultánea para cada uno de nuestros eventos. Si necesitan algún dispositivo de traducción, por favor, solicitarlo en la entrada principal. Y le vamos a pedir con mucho cariño que por favor coloquen sus teléfonos celulares en silencio.
Bueno, pues hoy tenemos mucho de qué aprender, mucho que hablar y justamente iniciamos con un seminario muy importante. Esta vez hablamos y lo enfocamos en la innovación agrícola para la seguridad alimentaria en el contexto de cambio climático en América Latina y el Caribe. Invito al escenario a Lina Salazar, economista líder de la División de Medio Ambiente, Desarrollo Rural y Administración del Riesgo por Desastres del BID, y a nuestros panelistas que nos acompañan en este primer seminario del día. Con el aplauso de todos ustedes.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Es un gusto estar con ustedes hoy acá compartiendo en este espacio. Quiero aprovechar para saludarlos a todos los que nos acompañan hoy acá en nuestra audiencia, pero también saludar a las personas que nos están siguiendo a través de nuestra transmisión en línea. Es un gusto estar con ustedes acá y con este panel tan especial. Bueno, para comenzar, hay que mencionar que los sistemas agroalimentarios están teniendo desafíos sin precedentes. Producir suficientes alimentos de calidad para contribuir a una población en crecimiento con alimentos nutritivos y saludables, contribuir también a reducir la pobreza y a proveer medios de vida prósperos y dignos. Todo esto protegiendo los recursos naturales y reduciendo las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. No es una tarea fácil. América Latina y el Caribe fue la única región que logró el objetivo de desarrollo
we have seen that a reversal in that trend. According to the FAO in the region, we have a significant number of people, 247 million individuals who are hungry. And just to give you some context, that is 5 times the population of Argentina. We also have the highest costs in our region for healthy diet. This is why 24% of the population has no access to these kinds of diets. As we can see, this is an alarming situation, a daunting challenge. But given this backdrop, we should be asking ourselves, what role can agricultural innovation play in improving food security as we face this climate crisis? And that is exactly what we will be discussing today here on our panel. We have a very diverse panel with a lot of experience from the private sector, the public sector, academia, and international research centers. This is a great panel, and this will also be a fantastic discussion. Before turning into that aspect of our panel, let me turn it over to Paul Winters, who is a professor of global affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and the dean. And Paul is also the CEO for climate change and agriculture. Paul, the mic's yours.
Thanks, everyone. So how I'd like to start out is talk about the perspectives that we have on agriculture and climate change right now. If you heard Lena and what she was mentioning about food security and the rise of food security in recent years. Generally speaking, in the last 4, 5, 6 years, there's been a great deal of discussion around agriculture. Previously, it was somewhat ignored in many respects, but now, especially with climate change, it's come front and center into the discussions. And so I wanted to start to tell you the kind of two different perspectives that you see out there. One is what we've seen more historically by people like me who are agricultural economists, and the other is this new narrative that's come out about food systems. So if you look at what might be called inclusive rural transformation, the way that we've thought about agriculture is that agriculture is a critical part of development. That yes, we see a shift in the economy away from agriculture towards industry and services, but that shift has always been accompanied by a rise in agricultural productivity. That is better and better use of agricultural resources over time. So those two things go together, that shift and the ability to produce. In terms of small-scale producers, a lot of the focus then has been on, yes, we need these productivity increases, but we also need to incorporate those smallholders. We need to make sure that they're able to participate in that process of rural transformation. Within this, climate change has been around for a long time. We've talked about it, but it's mainly been at the farm level, worrying about resilience. So this perspective, what we might call inclusive rural transformation, has been a key part of how we think about these things. The newer perspective that's been coming out is this idea that food systems are broken, and I hear that that statement all the time. Food systems are broken. It drives me a little bit crazy because we do produce enough food for 8 billion people in the world, but the point is that there actually are some issues with the food system and things that we really need to address. First is climate change isn't just a farm level problem, it's a bigger problem. We see entire shifts of production. So things like coffee can no longer be produced in some areas that they used to be produced. And so we need to shift agriculture. So climate change is a bigger deal than we thought. The other thing is that agriculture and food systems are big contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Particularly here in Latin America, it's a very large part of the overall emissions. And so that large amount needs to be addressed. And then finally, there's a big issue around nutrition. So part of the issue of food systems is not simply that there's climate change issues, but we have increasing obesity, increasing diabetes, all sorts of other issues in the world. So how do we reconcile these two views? And ultimately what I'm going to argue is that the best way out of this is through innovation, but doing innovation a little differently than we did in the past. So just to show a bit of data of how this works, or how this looks, on your left-hand side, you see data for the world. And the top productivity data, this is yields over time. You see that the OECD and East Asia has incredible productivity growth. Those are mostly high-income countries now. And as I said, part of their path is agricultural productivity growth. We need that growth. Latin America has done reasonably well, but not as well as some of the other regions. It has picked up since the 90s. But if you look at the right-hand side, you see that most of that has been driven by the Southern Cone. The Southern Cone, particularly since the 90s, has been growing even faster productivity than other parts, than OECD and East Asia. So you have these huge growths, but we see some issues in the Andes, Central America, and the Caribbean. So we have this diversity, and we need some catching up. In terms of climate change, one of the things that we have to realize is it's making those productivity gains much harder to do. It's much more challenging. And in this graph, you can see on the bottom axis is the Notre Dame gain, this adaptation index. The further over, the more vulnerable you are. So the further to your right, the more vulnerable. On the vertical axis, on this side, we have agricultural GDP. So what do we see? Those that rely most on agriculture are those that are most vulnerable. So this is a big problem, right? Those that are most, that agriculture is most important are most vulnerable. The same is true if you look at food security. This is the percent of food security, and again, we see this relationship. The most vulnerable are the most food insecure. So climate change is causing these great issues. So what transformation is needed? And what is the narrative out there over the last 4 or 5 years? And this comes from a variety of reports from the IPCC, the World Resources Institute, the Lancet report, so a whole set of reports that we have this shifting production patterns for climate change. That makes innovation or productivity gains challenging. We see that climate change and greenhouse gas emissions are very closely linked. So that's leading to cause to change land use patterns and adoption of low input agriculture. So you see on the right, this is the global contribution of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. They're about 25 to 33%. Most of and there's 2 different methods of trying to calculate this. Both of them are consistent though, that the large part of it is not in the value chain itself, but a large part of it is land use and the agriculture production. Hence the call to change land use patterns and agriculture production. The problem with that, of course, is we need those productivity gains, right? So how do we reconcile low input agriculture with productivity gains? Because it is those inputs that have allowed us to do those productivity gains. And then finally, this issue of consumer behavior and diets, food waste, that there's also these calls to shift consumer behavior. There was just a paper that came out about 2 weeks ago that said, at least in the United States, moral suasion, basically trying to make people feel guilty about eating meat and things that are bad for the planet, is completely ineffectual in getting people to shift their consumer behavior. So making us all feel guilty is not helping. So we really have to think about innovative ways to get people to shift. And there's this whole nutrition issue that Nea will be talking about that we need to address. So how do we match this with inclusive transformation? My argument is that we really need to have agricultural innovation. That's the critical part of it. Climate change and food security cannot be addressed if you don't have productivity gains. So we need those productivity gains, but we need to try to address climate change at the same time, which of course creates a huge challenge. The good news is there are actually a lot of innovations out there. There's biological ones that are being done. I was just reading an article last night from University of California, Berkeley, about the genetic modification of livestock in order to reduce emissions from those livestock and the potential there for that. So there's a huge range of these kind of innovations, and we need to double down on those productivity gains. I would also, though, note that innovations are different in the past. It used to be you could put out a new seed that was drought resistant, and then it would be adopted and move across. But when you're talking about something like digital agriculture, precision agriculture, it's not so straightforward in general. There's all these different platforms that keep getting put out and a lack of coherence. And it's much harder for small-scale producers than just to hand them a new variety. So it's much more complicated than in the past. And our current approaches are insufficient. We tend to focus a lot on staple crops, and we tend to focus a lot on livestock. And if we're concerned about nutrition, we're not focusing on making affordable and healthy foods. So we also need to consider how to shift. So the current approaches need to emphasize climate change more. They need to emphasize nutrition more. They need to shift from all the way to producers to consumers. Are there clever ways to get consumers to change their behavior? They need to focus on country conditions and, of course, incorporate the private sector. And in all of this, we need to ensure that there's inclusion. As I said, the good news is that innovations exist. So as Lena mentioned, I work with Michael Kramer, who won the Nobel Prize in 2019 in economics. He started an innovation commission last year. He launched it, Innovation Commission for Climate Change, Food Security, and Agriculture. And we were working closely with COP28, with United Arab Emirates. And at the COP, we announced these 7 examples of things that are shown to have an impact, right? Michael won his Nobel Prize out of doing randomized control trials to see what has an impact. And so we looked at the evidence, and we find all of these areas that have an impact and are cost effective, but they're being neglected by the market, meaning they're not naturally being taken to scale at present. And so we need to figure out ways to do this. So this is things like improved weather forecasting. There's new AI that is better at predicting weather. And we can use that if we can get it appropriate to farmers. The problem is most weather forecasts are not good for farmers. They're good for telling me whether I can go for my run the next morning, but they're not good for telling me if 2 weeks from now I should be planting. And so we need more weather. We need to use this new weather, but we need to make sure it's appropriate to farmers. Another example, which Brazil and maybe Sylvia will talk about, is these microbial fertilizers. These are microbes that put in the soil, bring in fertilizer better than they did before. And so you're able to reduce emissions, less synthetic fertilizer, and increase yields at the same time. So a bunch of examples. And then the last thing I want to mention is the means by which we take these things to scale. There's a lot of innovations out there, and we need to figure out how we're going to partially facilitate the private sector, but also the public sector to take these things to scale. Our tendency has to either be let the private sector take care of it, or let's put out some grants and just pay directly to innovators like Embrapa to come up with new ideas. There are other alternatives that we need to think, what Michael calls innovative ways to innovate. And 2 of these are put here. One is this push mechanism. Instead of saying, I'm going to provide investment in using seaweed to reduce emissions, what you do is you have an open call. And the open call is, we will fund any sort of research, phasing up, phasing out, that is linked to livestock and methane reduction. So you don't say, this is what we're going to do. This is what Development Innovation Ventures at USAID does right now, and you see that scaling. What they found is this portfolio approach, meaning you try to invest in a whole bunch of things, have these very high returns, 14 to 1. So not everything works, but enough things work really well that when you put the money into this approach, you can get these big returns. The second are these pull mechanisms. So things like advanced market commitments. So the idea behind this is that you guarantee a market for the private sector. So this has not been done much except for the small group called AgResults that was based out of the World Bank in the agricultural sector, but it's done a lot in health. So the famous example that Amanda here, who was part of, is the pneumococcal vaccine. So what that is that they needed pneumococcal vaccine for the tropics. And they weren't appropriate for the tropics, and no company wanted to produce it because they weren't going to make any money. So they got together over $1 billion and basically said, we will guarantee the market for you. We promise we will buy this. And what they did then is 3 companies ended up producing it for the market. Those 3 companies were paid. Over 200 million doses were ultimately given, and over 700,000 lives of children were saved as a result of this. So the idea is that you shape the market by putting those funds out there. Rather than putting them as a push mechanism, you pull the market to do. So it's a good way to get the private sector working on this. So the question we want to ask is, can you do something like this, say, for microbial fertilizers? We have the technologies there, they're just not taken to scale. Could you put out a call and basically say, we guarantee the market will happen and have those innovations? So let me stop there. The bottom message is, we have this complicated situation. Productivity is critical for development. We have these big issues in the food system. The only way we're going to try to be able to figure this out and move forward is to make sure that we have the innovations that can take care of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. As usual, very interesting presentation. I think we have a lot of information that we can use for the discussion today, so thank you very much. I want to start the panel with a very controversial question. And so when referring to agri-food systems, can we achieve net zero emissions, restore degraded resources, stop deforestation, improve livelihoods, and boost climate change resilience while providing nutritious food for all? Are we asking too much, or can we really have it all? So to answer this simple question, Sylvia, please, if you would like to give it a shot.
Thanks, Lina. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to first of all, I'd like to thank you, Pedro Martel and the BID, for this invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here with Paul, Neha, Francisco, and Lina. Thank you very much. But I think more comfortable to answer you in Portuguese. Then I switch from English to Portuguese. Thanks very much. Bem, Lina.
Well, Lina, it's not an easy question to answer. If we look at the history of agriculture in Brazil, what we have is tropical agriculture, and Paul's message is interesting. We went over 50 years, we changed from single culture systems to integrated systems in Brazil, where we have 2 or 3 different crops in the same area. We have been able to be more accurate with precision agriculture mapping systems. Also, we have used biological agents in agriculture. And so we have an agriculture which is multifunctional. We take into account food, we take into account sources of energy. So we look at different disciplines and work systematically to integrate them. Embrapa has a very interesting toolkit to address this. We are working at all levels of the production chain. So we work from beginning to end, and we work with different types of systems, integrated systems that we believe could be used more in Latin America and the Caribbean. For example, you were mentioning climate change. It's not only important for agriculture, we have to think of adaptation technology, biotechnology, also looking at how the water system can be harnessed better. In Brazil, we work at all these levels, and we look for cultivars that are more resistant to climate change, biotechnology, nanotechnology. When we look at bio-inputs or bioproducts, this is something we have been working on, trying to identify bacteria and microorganisms. And we're looking for ways to bring them into the system to make our crops more resistant, to make cultivars more resistant. We have examples in soybean, coffee, different fruits, and also how we use irrigation. We have adapted technology that have been used in the South. We've taken them to the West and found ways to apply them. Also, we need to consider harvesting techniques. It's important to have an integrated approach. It's the only way we can make a better use of data, of the information that is available. We have different types of data about the weather. We have information that comes from satellites. So we need to find a way to use that data to improve what we do, not only in planting, but also harvesting. Then we also need to look at aspects that have to do with logistics. So we're using cultivars, bioproducts, different types of equipment, machinery, and we look at all types of agriculture, all levels, small, medium, and large producers. What I would say is important is to look at this as a challenge we all face. The entire world has to look at food security. We need to produce healthy foods in a sustainable manner, not just looking at business angles. We also need to look at social and environmental aspects. Now, we are going through a transition. These are changes affecting the entire world, and I would say there's 5. There's a nutritional transition, which Paul mentioned. Our consumers are more aware. They want healthier foods. They want to know where the food comes from. So we need to have sustainability and traceability. Both are important. Also, there's an energy transition underway. We have new options to produce clean energy. A lot is said about the green economy. In Brazil, since we have 2 or 3 harvests, we are also working with second-generation ethanol. We plant millet or soy, and then we reuse the plants to produce energy. Then we also speak of plant and animal health. So it's not just one type of health. We need to look at the ways to integrate animal health, plant health, and the environment. That is a monumental challenge. And then there's also a climate transition underway. We have more and more extreme events. El Niño and La Niña are taking place so quickly that it's hard to plan. Then we also need to look at low-carbon agriculture. In Brazil, we've been working for more than 10 years on a policy for low-carbon agriculture and for more sustainable practices. Also, bio-inputs. We need to use nitrogen fixation. We need to use more integrated ways to not only produce, but also to raise livestock. We need to look at agroforestry as well. So it's important to do all of this to achieve a low-carbon agriculture. And then we have the digital transformation process. It is also important so that, because it is a cross-cutting area. Without technology, we cannot address very complex systems. So it's not just information and information technology. We need to look at biotechnology, nanotechnology, telecommunications. So we can't look at these disciplines as isolated disciplines. They have to be connected. We need to use all the means available in an integrated fashion, and this is important so that we can achieve results. So the challenge is huge, but I do think that integrated approaches work. In Brazil, we have Embrapa, but Embrapa does not work alone. It works with an entire ecosystem in public and private partnerships. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thanks, Lena, for the very easy question. Good morning, everyone. I don't think I can answer the question, but I would like to unpack it a little bit. So as economists, we learn constrained optimization, where households, you maximize utility, which is derived from consumption of various goods and services, given a budget constraint. So, and to solve this problem, you need to know both pieces really well. What are the constraints? What are we trying to optimize? So if I were to phrase this question, I would say, how can we achieve zero emissions and nutritious food for all, given the resources we have? So what we really need is a multidisciplinary approach, very much like what Paul discussed in his talk. We need to get together policymakers, researchers, academics, people who are on the ground implementing, to find the challenges and then identify solutions for doing this. And since emissions created by one country affect other countries as well, we need international collaboration as well. And as daunting as this task might seem, not following through is, the consequences are even more daunting. Time is a resource, and we are running out of it very quickly. We need to start now. We need to make actions now, maybe yesterday. So in that vein, I think I would like to put forward a few action points. What can we do? The agronomists and the environmental scientists can get together and identify what foods to produce. Perhaps the engineers can weigh in on where they should be produced and what the emission implications are of bringing them to the right people. But we, the research community working in the agriculture nutrition space, we need to figure out ways of how the people will actually eat this food. So you might have all the healthy food on the planet, but if people still go for the cheeseburger and the Coke, then what's the point of it? So I think for us, it's important for us to identify what are the barriers to a healthy diet, what are the constraints, and how can we get people to eat the healthy food that gets produced. So maybe something on the line of the moral suasion that Paul was saying. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. Francisco?
Yeah, just picking up first, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I'm going to take more the entrepreneurial venture capital angle, picking up from my fellow scientist friends. One thing that called our attention and it, I think makes ag tech investing such a special place is that we were never able to separate these targets from the companies that we back targets. So every single ag tech investment that we have done, and many of them came from Embrapa as spin-offs over the past few years, whether in biologics or digital agriculture, they always implied creating, building productivity, guaranteeing food security, increasing profit margins, and distributing profit margins more fairly across the value chain. So in ag tech, these things are implicitly very much together. And what we've noticed over the past few years is that the new technologies that are arriving to farmland, they're coming through small companies. So this revolution that we saw in many other geographies of the world in terms of technology, where small companies became the most efficient vehicle to bring these new innovations because they mean new technologies with new business models, this has also hit farming over the past few years, and it's become a very efficient way. So one example that we have always been using is the biologics industry in Latin America. Brazil is today the most thriving, effervescent biological market in the world. It's a biological market that has been driven by startups. It's created a lot of value for local farmers, for local entrepreneurs, for local investors, and it's helped build climate resiliency and productivity, shifting away from a chemistry-based agriculture, so also facing mitigation. So we believe that it's definitely joined. When you talk about agriculture innovation, we're talking about livelihood, we're talking about food security, we're talking about guaranteeing all these elements.
Great, thank you. Paul?
I would just add, I think we can do all those things. So to me, it's a question of, can we do it sooner or can we do it later? I mean, we've heard all these great, and Embrapa's amazing, and she didn't pay me to say that. Francisco's right. Brazil is way ahead of everyone else right now in a lot of these things. And they're pushing the frontier. The frustrating thing is it's only in Brazil, right? And there's potential around Latin America as well as in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and if we wait for the market to deal with this, it'll take too long. And impact investors like Francisco are pushing these frontiers. How do we incentivize them to break the frontiers, right? To go even further in Latin America and around the world. So I do think we can do it. The question is whether it takes so long that the planet's burned in the meantime, or whether we actually could do it in a speedy fashion. And so this is why we need, IDB Invest, the governments around the region to push this forward as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Paul, and I'm very happy to see that everybody is so optimistic, so it's always nice. So the evidence shows that for every dollar invested in agricultural research, we can obtain between $10 to $30 in benefits. However, in Latin America and the Caribbean, with few exceptions, most of the countries invest less than 1% of their agricultural GDP on research and development. Silvia, You are, I have to say, the first woman president of Embrapa, the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation. What do you think should be the role of the public sector in fostering research and innovation in agriculture? Do you think that the government should write in the back seat, or it should limit their interventions to fix market failures, or it should take a leading role?
In Brazil, the government is very important. Embrapa is a public entity. It is under the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock, and we have been in existence for 50 years. And over those 50 years, Embrapa has been a facilitator. It has worked to promote innovation in the country, so it's done so through public-private partnerships. It has also worked with startups over the last few years. So what I think is important to point out, what makes Brazil different perhaps from other countries, is that we have science-based agriculture, and we have a science program that is based on public policy. So just to give you an example, in the country, we have a risk matrix where we take into account climate. And this matrix tells us what to plant and where, what cultivar, what municipality, and it gives you ranges. And this is done for 32 different units in Embrapa, and it's applied in 5,000 municipios in the country. We have worked with the Agricultural Policy Secretariat in the ministry and have more than 200 researchers in our network. And that is something we've been able to do in the country. We worked with research, development, and innovation. It's a process, and it's used to build public policy and to receive feedback. So the government does play a key role in setting public policy. Now, we also have a new public policy at the federal level, and it's aimed at improving food security, thinking that we have 9 billion people, and that is the numbers we have according to FAO data. So we need to look at all three dimensions: environmental, social, and economic. And what Brazil has been doing is focusing on how to recover degraded areas. So how to increase production. By doing that, we have 60,000 hectares, and of those, 40 million have agricultural potential. So that is a resource that can be tapped, and we can connect science and public policy, which is what we're doing. So Embrapa is involved by bringing in technology, mapping, cross-referencing data from zoning and climate change, together with banks. We work on how to encourage rural producers to focus on those areas using more sustainable areas, integrating nitrogen, also other bio inputs. So we do this in a coordinated fashion. We also look at new research that is needed in those areas. The result of that research comes back to Embrapa, and this gives rise to a cycle where we work in an integrated fashion to connect research with our production and enhance productivity. Over 50 years, we have expanded our area of work by 140%. Initially, we had a budget of 25 million, or 25 hectares rather, and we've increased it to 60. But we increased productivity by 580%. So in the same area, by using technology, we have been able to produce more in the same area. So I think that that is the kind of approach we need to increase production and yields and productivity, but focusing on policy. And this is where the government comes in. Embrapa is a public institution, and it is an important connector. It does not work alone. It works with a network. It brings in the market, brings in public companies, other public agencies, universities, and also startups. Francisco mentioned that we have been a facilitator for the innovation system in Brazil. We have looked at supply chain for different products, fruit, vegetable, even rice. And we have worked with digital technologies, biotechnologies, biogoods, bio input. And we've also been a mentor. Embrapa is a living laboratory. So startups and entrepreneurs come to us and they work with us and with our researchers. So I would say that it is important for the government to be involved. Embrapa is a public institution, and as such, it has played the role of facilitator.
But I also would like to know, and as you mentioned, we need to work in very coordinated manner with the public sector, the private sector, researchers, academia, and so on. So I would like to hear from Francisco your perspective from the private sector. As the co-founder and director of SP Ventures, which is a fund investing in tech power solutions for agriculture and food across Latin America, I would like to know, what do you think is the role of the government on fostering agricultural innovation, and how can the public and private sectors achieve this coordination that Silvia was talking about?
It's a very good point, Lina. So for us, when we look at the entrepreneurial finance for tech-powered solutions in Latin American ag tech, there's obviously a market failure in the region. In Brazil specifically, agribusiness represents nearly 25% of GDP, but it's less than 5% of venture capital. And it's probably perceived as one of the most innovative major categories in the region, so it should be attracting more capital. The reasons that this market failure occurs are pretty straightforward. The cycles of working capital and capex in agriculture are different from other categories. There's a lot of risks that traditional financiers are not used to running. So there's biological risk, there's climate risk, which is very dynamic and growing. There's commodity price risk. There's foreign exchange price risk. So it's expected to be a much more harder to finance value chain. And when we look at venture capital specifically, I think traditional investors tend to compare the different venture capital asset classes. And when you look at ag, it has a much longer cycle. So this takes longer to liquidity, and this is perceived as perhaps a higher risk and harder to things, work out. So the cycle. And when we look at the specific cycle of adoption of technologies within the year, picking up on the 2-3 cycles that Sylvia mentioned, even though the region can adopt technology quicker because you have more cycles to sell technology to farmers within the same year, it's not like a consumer technology from an urban center where you can sell technologies all year long, 365 days of the year. You have those specific windows where farmers are adopting technology. So you need to understand the sector. You need to build the investor conscience of the sector. One thing that we have been very, so far successful at SP Ventures in doing is in being able to attract not the obvious private sector stakeholders. So one that has come and has been very supportive, not only in financial capital, but also in strategic value in helping build these technologies and helping build these go-to-market strategies, are corporate investors. So today we have investors that are the corporate and innovation teams of the largest ag input companies, trading companies, farm equipment companies. So these guys have gotten very engaged. And as Farmit is a very integrated supply chain, having these guys on board helps not only bring financial capital, intellectual capital, but also bridging supply chain and adoption gaps. So I think the challenge is, how do we crowd in more private capital through public investment and not crowd out? Basic research is also a critical area. Farming is perhaps much more multidisciplinary when we see ag tech. It demands hardware technologies and innovation. It demands software, cloud computing, biologics, biology across the board. So all these different expertises need to be fused together in the same organization. This has also made it harder to become proficient. So there are many reasons. We see it happening. I think we need one or two more cycles to show more private investors that this is a game-winning asset class. I think all the pros, size, tendency, they're there. And many of the capital markets in Brazil specifically, again, the same market failure has happened in traditional capital markets. That's the same ratios. And we've seen over the past few years, a lot of companies start to tap into private markets, capital markets, and be able to raise, even not in the innovation. So I think that there is a market failure. I think we need to bring private sector more and more. I think it's a fundamental solution to the problem. And I think governments need to find ways where they crowd in, where they leverage and they bring always more private sector investment together with their public sector dollars.
Great. Thank you, Francisco. I think it's very interesting what you mentioned, how the government plays also a role on crowding in investment into these technologies and innovations. But so far, most of the technologies that we talk about and the innovations have focused on increasing agricultural production in terms of calories and not necessarily with the consideration of food security and nutrition. So today, Latin America and the Caribbean has the highest cost of accessing a healthy diet. And as I mentioned before in the introduction, 24% of our population can access to it, can have access to it, which could result on harmful consequences on human development and health outcomes. So innovative interventions are also needed in terms of improving nutrition and healthy foods. So for this, Neha, given your role as a senior researcher for the International Food Policy Research Institute, can you explain us what is nutrition-sensitive agriculture and what is the link between food security, nutrition, and agriculture?
Great. Thanks, Lena. I would like to emphasize what you just said. Increasing agricultural production does not mean that it'll lead to healthy diets. So agriculture and agricultural policies in many countries is focused on production of staples like wheat, maize, rice. And for a healthy diet, we need more than that. We need all the right nutrients. So, so nutrition-sensitive agriculture is an approach which promises to achieve this nutrition outcome by going beyond the standard approach of producing more food, but by producing more nutrient-dense foods like fruits and vegetables, animal source foods, dairy, etc. And also by incorporating nutrition objectives in the agriculture interventions that address the underlying determinants of undernutrition, which is food security, access to adequate childcare resources, healthcare services, and also a hygienic environment. Also, these programs can go beyond including nutrition objectives by, in fact, having a nutrition-specific interventions integrated in them where they provide nutrition counseling on the best infant and young child feeding practices to caregivers. And it's also important, and rather imperative, to recognize the role that women play as caregivers, not only as caregivers, but also as mothers. So healthy mothers lead to healthy babies. More empowered women that have access to resources, have autonomy in decision-making, are more capable of providing health, better food, and care for their families. So when we empower women, we are doing a lot more. And I think it's important to say it today, just a day ahead of International Women's Day tomorrow. An example of nutrition-sensitive agriculture that has proven quite effective at improving nutrition outcomes is Helen Keller International's model of enhanced homestead food production model. So this is essentially a home garden model. Sometimes it has poultry included in it, and it's enhanced by the nutrition counseling that I just mentioned, which just provides messaging around how can you provide or feed your children and your family better? This has been proven effective in a lot of Asian countries, and it was tested in Burkina Faso in Africa for the first time, and it led to very favorable nutrition outcomes there as well. On the issue of affordability of healthy diets and lifestyles, social protection, social safety nets do have promise. But examples from Mexico and Guatemala provide a case of caution. So it is not a good idea to provide food or energy-dense food in a context where overweight and obesity is already rising. So we need to make sure the programs that we develop are designed based on what the context is. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting, this whole approach of also using agriculture to improve nutritional outcomes, and how can this be a big contributor to it. And so, Paul, you were mentioning some of the technologies that are widely available, but they have demonstrated to be very successful on improving agricultural productivity, food security, climate resilience. However, these technologies are not always adopted by farmers, especially by small landholder farmers and medium landholder farmers, due to many restrictions, financial, information, lack of interest sometimes of the private sector to invest in this typology of farmers. So, Paul, what do you think could be a successful dissemination strategy to promote the adoption of new technologies, particularly among small landholder farmers? And you mentioned some of this during your presentation, but if you could expand on it, that would be great.
Right, so there's a long history of trying to understand adoption among small-scale producers and all the challenges, credit limitations, input limitations, all of that. So those limitations still exist and cause the normal problems that we see with adoption. I'd like to, though, focus a little bit on this issue around climate change. And the real problem that we face is that, particularly for mitigation, there's no commercial incentive for any farmer, whether they're small or large, to do things like reduce livestock emissions. And so even though the technologies are starting to be developed for this, the incentives aren't there. Now, just over a month ago, Argentina was the first country to have a certification for carbon neutral livestock. So it was done a private-public partnership. So the private sector, this company, I think it's called San Ramon, worked with INEA, the National Ag Research, and the industry, the national industry, to come up with the certification. They went to the International Environmental Product Organization and got it certified. And it seems to be working. It's a silver pastoral system, so it's rather complicated. And it requires a lot of management of how you manage grasslands and the forests and everything. I don't think smallholders are ever going to be able to do that type of thing. But there's all of these other possibilities, right? There's seaweed that as a food supplement that reduces emissions up to 80, 90%. There's other types of food additives. There's a vaccine that a group at Oxford is trying to work on, where you vaccinate cows against emissions. And then there's also this genetic possibilities. The problem still, though, is there's no incentive to do it unless you have something like a certification system. So I do think that part of the innovations that we're going to need to see is not in the technology, but also in the market and how we do that. So the incentive for that Argentinian group is the European Union. They're putting in rules, and if they want to export there, they need to have low emissions. And so they're foreseeing getting into that market. We could see something like that getting much larger, though, if we can kind of get those incentives. So on the mitigation side, how do we get the incentives right and internalize those externalities and get a higher price? And then the examples like weather, they're there to be taken, right? The estimate is for every $1 you invest in weather, you get over $100 return because it's not that expensive to actually get the information. The hard part is getting it out to farmers in the right way. But once you do, the yield increases are pretty substantial. So I think we have to deal with simultaneously kind of those traditional problems, but this creates a whole nother set of problems to add on to that, and we need to work on those at the same time.
Kind of just complementing one point that we've seen in terms of tech adoption within the different ranges of farm sizes in Brazil, but also expanding to the greater tropical ecosystem. We see the large growers, they have custom-made solutions for them. You know, they go out and they build it themselves. The small growers pose a major challenge in terms of adoption because the unit economics for young technology startups in the region, it's very negative. They're expensive to get, and you can charge a small ticket to serve. So you need to think out of the box. What we believe and what we've seen massively over the past few years, and we believe it's trickling down, is that technology over the medium to long term has a radically democratizing aspect to it. It starts out in a specific category, and then it trickles down as it becomes cheaper and more readily accessible. The first category to adopt these massive technologies in the region has been the middle grower. The middle grower has closed the perfect economics for these small startup companies that are launching cloud computing, mobile solutions. We've seen the middle grower not only being able to pay, but also be technically prepared to adopt, implement, and extract the full productivity that these technologies are bringing. But we've been seeing the levels and the size of growers that these technologies are able to reach on a year-by-year basis going down. So being able to reach smaller and smaller. The base of the pyramid is still extraordinarily vulnerable and still has very little access. So the technologies are getting there. But still probably going to take a few more years if we don't think of an innovative way to speed up this adoption, but it's getting there, and technology over the long run is highly democratizing.
Yes.
Lina, sorry. I just quickly, sorry. I missed, when I gave the example of the enhanced homestead food production models, I missed to say that in the race to having technological innovation, we shouldn't forget that some of the low-tech, low-cost innovations also work. And this is just a really great example. You know, it's just a garden in your backyard where you're growing vegetables. You might have some poultry in there as well. So this is just an example where it's not necessary that you always need the technology. It is important. I'm not saying that, but I'm just to remember that some of these low-tech things still work, and why shouldn't they? So thanks, that's all.
And that's a very good point, because sometimes when we think about technology, we just imagine the drones and the satellites, but there are also very accessible technologies and very simple that are very useful and profitable as well. Silvia, go ahead.
Neste tópico, nós, Brasil, temos.
Brazil has a new project which we started in 2023 in this area, which could then be shared with other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's a project to include small, medium producers. We work with Fabesp, which is a development agency. And the idea is to have pilot projects, and we're working with different producer associations, farmer cooperatives, and we work on 3 pillars: research and innovation, connectivity, and training. So we identify the needs, research needs, go to Embrapa or the universities. What is market-based goes to the local ecosystem, and the idea is to build that system. And then we also have connectivity and training pillars. So we've done it with coffee, with fruit and vegetables, and we are expanding to include other areas as well. And we develop reference models and try to explain how technology can help improve yield, also reduce cost, and provide the means to achieve certification. So it's another interesting experiment, if you will, that we can later share with other countries. It's a 5-year project. Once it is completed, we will have a self-sustainable system. There will be private companies, suppliers, and cooperatives. They will all participate, and all of this leads to more scale. So it's an interesting, I think, experience we can share with other countries.
experience, and I was actually going to ask you something in that regard, and is how can research and development in agriculture be able to challenge and tackle food insecurity while improving climate change adaptation mitigation, particularly among small landholder farmers. And I think what you mentioned was really very interesting and actually answering to my next question, so that was great. Thank you. And so Neha, I wanted to ask you, based on your research in food security and nutrition worldwide, can you share with us some of your experiences or some examples that have been actually implemented in different regions, but that can be replicated in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Sure, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll share examples from South Asia, which we can apply, but I don't think we should replicate because context differs quite a bit, but I think the lessons can be drawn from the South Asian context to the Latin American context. So I'll share an example from Bangladesh. It's more of like a story because it evolved over multiple years. So back in 2010, 2011, when IFPRI was setting up an office in Dhaka, we designed a nationally representative survey. And during the design, we decided to collect gender disaggregated data on women's empowerment, on nutrition outcomes, and a few things. And when we analyzed that data, we found associations, strong positive associations between women's empowerment, nutrition outcomes, and agriculture. So this really intrigued the government. And as they say in our circles, you know, what gets measured gets done. So we designed an intervention along with the government which combined nutrition-sensitive agriculture with nutrition counseling and a component that had gender sensitization around, you know, feeding practices, just sharing of workload and the such. And so we designed a pilot, and it was designed in such a way that we could tease out what the impact of each additional component would be. So when we did the analysis, we found that the arm which combined all three, the agriculture, nutrition-sensitive agriculture, the nutrition counseling, as well as the gender sensitization, had the most favorable outcomes. So this just suggests that we can combine these three different components. It's not really interdisciplinary, it's more multi-sectoral in nature. The next example that I want to share is an example from India which didn't really work well. But I must say that we learn as much from interventions that don't work as we do from the ones that do work. So this was an intervention that used women's groups. These are very prevalent in India. They are savings groups. Often they have agriculture livelihood components as well. So what we did in India was we used these women's groups that met on a frequent every month or every other month to discuss what they were doing. We said, let's layer into their activities nutrition messaging so they can eat better and communicate to others in the village. But what we ended up finding was that this approach didn't really work. And what I want to highlight from this learning is that in addition to doing quantitative analysis where you measure, before, you measure after, and then you say, okay, this is the impact, if you just do that and don't invest in understanding the process of how the implementation worked and understanding why so I think you should understand the impact when there is an impact and when there is none. So lucky or unlucky for us, we did qualitative work and we did process evaluation, which threw light on our intervention design. So we found that the exposure to the messaging was limited. The people who were delivering the messages weren't very high skilled, so they needed more training to be able to deliver these kinds of messages. And lastly, actionability of messages. So you can tell people to eat better, but then are they able to take an action on this. There could be resource constraints, there could be cultural norms that constrain their behaviors. So all of this is really important when you're designing an intervention, and it's important to consider it when you're actually doing that. At the end, what do we get from here? I think there is promise in combining agriculture, nutrition, women's empowerment to help for the agriculture sector to deliver on nutrition and healthy diets, but it requires effective work. It's important that interventions are delivered with fidelity. So they're delivered as designed or as intended. And then an important research question that remains for many of us is whether we need to integrate everything into this multi-sectoral approach, or can services be delivered by the different sectors, but they co-locate on the same households. So these are all research questions that we are trying to answer, like, do you need to have everything delivered together, or do you just work with different departments where we bring in the multidisciplinary collaborations and try to focus on the same households so they get everything? So, thanks.
Great. Yes, I think it's key what you mentioned on the importance of measuring and how we can actually not only learn from the interventions that work, but also from the interventions that don't work. No, I think it's very important, and to understand the process of the implementation, to identify what are the different challenges and the problems that could actually restrict having this impact. So this is very important. Unfortunately, our time is running off, and we need to conclude the panel. But before that, I would like to ask our panelists here to leave a 1-minute message for the audience, just a key message that you want to leave us with. So let's start with Paul.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion about transforming food systems and this declaration at the COP for addressing food, et cetera. That's all important, and it's great that food has become front and center in the discourse, but we really just need to start doing some things and start pushing forward with ideas that will transform things. There are opportunities out there from Ambrapa, from the private sector, from others, and we need to get those taken to scale. And there are tons of innovations, and I agree with Neha. There's biological, technical, social innovations. There's low-tech, high-tech, whatever uses scarce resources in a better way to increase productivity and address climate change and nutrition. We should be doing it, and let's just do it. So.
Silvia.
Bem, mais uma vez, obrigada pela oportunidade.
Once again, thank you for the opportunity. I think it is important for us to work in an integrated fashion, addressing the entire ecosystem. The banks, development organizations like the IDB, FAO, ICA, and others have a key role to play in helping us set priorities. We need to look at what is happening in Latin America and the Caribbean and other regions of the world so that we can work towards food security. So it's important to look for more integrated approaches. Just to give you an example, in South America, there are initiatives underway where there's national institutions collaborating. Embrapa, INTA Argentina, also institutions from Paraguay and Uruguay. So they are working and collaborating. So again, it's important to have more integrated approaches and maximize opportunities like this so that we can work together to make the world enjoy better food security. Thank you.
I think if we want to focus on nutrition, we have to be intentional. trickle down doesn't work for nutrition outcomes. So if we just by increasing incomes, it's not necessary that people will eat healthier food. So my one suggestion is let's be more intentional. And while we are addressing malnutrition, undernutrition, we should keep an eye out on the overnutrition. So let's not forget that aspect. So thank you.
Just building on, I think, a topic we've already put on the table here today, but it's important to emphasize. There are not that many investment categories and asset classes where we are in 3 battlegrounds with the same dollar: food security, economic prosperity, and climate change. At the same time, because of the particularities of agriculture, there have been consistent market failures, and government participation is key to building this crowding in and leveraging more dollars. So I take my panelists' recommendation of a call to action to look at these categories. At SP Ventures, we'll be issuing our new impact report in the next couple of weeks, and we'll really measure the correlation between all these metrics, and it'll be much more obvious. We'll get it out to all of you, and let's get more involved.
Great. Bueno, antes de despedirme, quiero agradecerles a los...
Well, before closing this segment, I want to thank our panelists who have been with us. It's truly a pleasure to have you here, to join you on stage today and be able to hear all of these experiences and all of these examples shared by you. It's all very interesting. Also wanted to state in closing that, yes, we are facing daunting challenges, but there are also huge opportunities in the region when it comes to agricultural innovation, and that is why there's a need for working together, for having an approach that is evidence-based, and use that as a tool to take on all of the challenges we're currently facing. Again, we have great opportunities before us, and that is the takeaway. Thank you all very much. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the audience. Thank you.
Gracias, Aline.
Thank you very much, Alina, and thank you to our panelists. Very insightful. Once again, let's give them a hand.
Hacemos una...
We are going to have a very short break at 10:30. We're going to begin with our next seminar, and we are going to be discussing citizen security. So please, if you do step out, don't go too far. Let's make the most of these few minutes, and let's come right back, because at 10:30 sharp, we are going to begin the next seminar. Thank you.